is doing it nicely already. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the session today. You are all on mute already, which is great. Please be muted just to keep the noise down. We have time for questions at the end of our session, which won't hopefully last longer than 30 minutes, as promised. And yeah, it is, my name is Katharina, and my colleague Simon, he's on the call as well, if he might chip in for any comments or questions or answers in between. And then we have Lauren and Francis from Dual Creative Media, who we will lead the webinar with. I'm just trying to make sure that everyone is admitted now. Okay. Yes. Okay, great. So why we're here and why we have set up these webinar series. So as we are all aware, this year has started to pose significant challenges to many businesses and people, and forcing brands to evolve and respond very quickly to the ongoing changes and global challenges. And it's not possible for brands anymore to take a lot of time to respond and engage with their audiences, but it has become quite critical for brands to really know who they are, what they stand for, why they exist, and then equally important, who is their audience, what drives their audience's behavior and purchases, and how do you best as a brand respond and engage with them. And in order for brands to pivot and not pause in the face of, it seems like now, constant change, we set up this webinar as we found many brands are used to very lengthy, complex, and often very expensive processes to evolve their brands. And from our experience, we know that this doesn't need to be the case. And brands can develop and change and evolve in a much more agile, more budget-friendly and impactful way. And with these series that we have created and are running, we want to share our joint experiences and how we have achieved this for many brands in the past, and share our experience and knowledge and how you could achieve this too. So I hand over to Lauren now, who will set up the scene again for our series and what we are going to talk about today.
So hi everyone, thank you for those who have returned. We haven't scared you off too much, and thank you to those who are new, and thank you to those who are viewing from home. I feel a little bit like a TV presenter whenever I'm doing this. But we have been running, as Katharina said, this webinar for the last couple of weeks, and this is sort of now the middle of the series, and we're talking today about brand narrative specifically, where we talk a little bit about how we approach a new narrative, or potentially how we pivot to a new narrative over the coming weeks. Next week we'll talk a bit more about channel roles and responsibilities, but hopefully this will set the scene a little bit more about how you can look holistically at brand comms and how to approach it specifically through the lens of the global pandemic. Today, on the next slide, we will attempt to sort of talk to you about why purpose or brand narratives are important, creating a clear brand narrative or purpose, and then considerations for when you've got that brand purpose when it comes to building your narrative. Again, just to kind of set the scene a little bit about, you know, what's been going on over the last couple of months, is that we're under no illusion that the last couple of months have been incredibly difficult for everyone. There has been business closures, operational changes, financial and economic uncertainty, and everyone has had to somewhat sort of shift the gear to meet the demand of this new world that we're living in. And to that effect, when we talk about what the then and now looks like, we always sort of think normally in sort of normal terms that the then was a couple of years ago, sort of the historic idea of the past, but actually it's been very, very, very short. And we talked about this last time, that it's only been about 3 months since this whole sort of gear shift has happened. And like Katharina said, is that the now is very much disruptive, and it's always a constant idea of change. And how we attribute or how we look at that change is really, really important, because it's going to continue changing. Things will not be sort of static for a long period of time.
And what has kind of characterized this crisis, or characterizes any crisis, are the very dominant negative emotions that we all go through, and especially people go through, customers go through, employees go through. And it is fundamental for brands to understand how to respond to these emotions that we all experience, because that's ultimately what customers and employees alike are looking for brands to do. They need the steer, basically, or almost the vision of how they want to engage with brands. And so from panic, anxiety, anger, shock, confusion that is experienced, helplessness, disappointment, denial, hopelessness, and shame, customers are looking for brands that respond to these extreme negative emotions with some clarity, with calmness, with some sort of certainty, with some optimism to counter hopelessness, etc. And it is crucial for brands to understand that it's not about, which has been done in the past a lot, to force customers or force a narrative down to customers on how they should feel. But it becomes so much more important now for brands to understand the emotional situation that customers are in, and responding accordingly, rather than forcing something, but responding and reflecting how people really feel, because ultimately that is what customers will attune to and look out for and will respond positively to.
So we see that as very much an opportunity for brands right now. I think there can be sometimes a shift where people think, oh, what do we do? How do we respond to this? But actually, if we look at it from a sort of an opportunity point of view, it's literally how tone and behavior has really counteracted how we believe in the first impression. And I think it's really important that brands should look at this crisis moment and see how they can build different types of narratives out of them to help reflect the zeitgeist of now. I think at this point, it's really easy for us to say, that brands, or for brands to be able to tell stories, or to say all these different types of things, that they can be either relatable, inspiring, simple, proactive, and so on and so forth. It's much harder to implement. So we need to do or get better at really pinpointing a focus that aligns from the top down of a business. Sorry, go back one more slide, please. Go back to the previous slide, thank you. It really is important that we align from the top down of the business all the way through to something as mundane as like a social post that sort of taps into these different types of brand stories. Because again, like Katharina said, it's all about reflecting what people really feel and not trying to force feed something that isn't authentic to both brand and consumer. That relationship between brand and consumer has fundamentally changed. So we have to be really mindful that this is transitioned in an authentic way. So looking at some examples of brands over the last couple of weeks, we've seen how some brands have had to pivot their narratives quite quickly. And the next few examples that you see over the current slide, or of these slides, will be kind of more in the context or through the lens of COVID-19. So we've seen some brands who have been potentially in the past a little bit more serious, use humor as a way to counterbalance what's happening in the world. So again, looking at a brand like Spotify, where traditionally they have been very much sort of cultural, sort of topical. They have access to a lot of people's information in terms of what they listen to and what they're feeling at that present moment in time, so they can really use it to their best advantage. They use humor to counterbalance how people are naturally feeling when it comes to the playlists that they're creating through their Spotify channel. So the time's not right for dancing in the streets, stay at home, let the music take you. Again, understanding that music evokes an emotion, and we should try and build a certain level of humor in a state of sort of worldwide panic, was a really important message for them to start pivoting towards, specifically under the guise of lockdown. We've seen other brands look at panic and how they can sort of engage and reinforce a message of clarity to help inform people. Just before we play this example, I think everyone can feel a little bit this sort of attribute of what panic or unclarity means, or uncertainty means under the guise of COVID-19. I always think about the meme that came out a few weeks ago of Matt Lucas taking the piss out of Boris Johnson, where he says, don't go to work, go to work, go to school, don't go to school, we have to stay at home, don't stay at home. This is kind of the sort of the general feeling and sentiment at the moment of what people are getting out of, let's say, for example, the government. So some brands have used this stance to think about how can we ensure that what we're doing and what we're saying to people is so unbelievably clear that there is no point of confusion, that we're not adding to the confusion that's already there. So Tesco had a really good example of this at the very, very beginning of the lockdown. They didn't try and shove sort of price points or service offering or product down people's throats. They talked about the fact that their operations are going to change, and therefore this is how it's going to change and what we should all be mindful of. So ensuring that through this sort of mass confusion of what's going on in the world, they could do something that helps people, again, sticking very true to their brand purpose of every little helps. They created content that ensured that things were unbelievably clear. So we'll play you a few seconds of it just to give you an example of.
Here's some little helps for safer shopping. To help limit the number of people in store at once, you might be asked to queue when you arrive. Stand 2 meters apart. The markings on the ground will help.
There'll be a cleaning station to clean a trolley or basket.
Markers will help you keep 2 meters from each other. Please do keep to them.
The screen is to help protect us and you.
So we'll pay in by card where you can.
These are here to help you shop as safely as you can, because now, more than ever, every little helps.
So again, they're not trying to do anything overly expansive or overly creative. They're just trying to be really clear. And I think there's not enough brands at the moment trying to be clear in how they sort of are changing their operations to meet the demand of tomorrow. So another example that we've seen over the last couple of weeks is from profit to purpose. And again, a lot of people tend to think that just because I'm maybe not a brand that is a charitable organization or non-for-profit, or I'm not a B Corp, for example, therefore how can I be a purpose-driven brand? Now, an example of a brand that has done this really beautifully has been Allbirds shoes. Now, they are effectively, they sell shoes, they sell sneakers, but very, very early on during the pandemic, they sent out a message that they were donating shoes to healthcare workers on the front lines fighting COVID-19. Now, again, there have been a lot of brands over the last couple of months that have sort of jumped on the proverbial bandwagon of doing things like this in relation to the NHS, but Allbirds were kind of at the beginning of the pandemic. And what's really interesting about them is the fact that they did something that was unbelievably truthful to who they are as a business. Their entire brand mission is to ensure that comfort, good design, and sustainability are all part and parcel of the same world, that don't have to be mutually exclusive. And they have this wider narrative of doing better. So again, doing something like this in a crisis mode actually related very authentically to what they are as a business. So again, purpose-driven messaging, purpose-driven missions can be really, really useful as long as they are authentic to the core of the business. We've seen a lot of transitioning from about us stories to about you. Again, focusing away from the brand, focusing much, much, much more on the individual. An example of this happened to be Voxy. Voxy is a data network for mobile phones, but it is specifically designed or geared up towards a younger audience. Now, again, at the very beginning of the pandemic, they set out this narrative to ensure that their younger customers who are constantly seeking connection, constantly seeking engagement with people through social, that their stories turn to being much, much more about the individual than the product or service. To give you a bit of a teaser or a snippet of this, is what they did.
With Voxy, I can be endless, even in my slippers. I'm a fitness guru. Let's keep going. Come on, guys. I'm a pro baker. Shit, but not for the recipe yet. I'm a quiz show host. Welcome to tonight's show. One for you and one for you. I'm still a romantic. I'm a DJ. I'm an international DJ.
Connected, stay endless with Voxy, the mobile network with endless social media.
So I think it's a really good example of a brand doing something where it took very much the narrative of the individual versus the sort of the brand premise itself, and moved it from being much, much more about the individual than about us. And to follow from this, we've seen other brands talk about personal stories over product stories. We've seen brands such as Grazia and Vogue magazine do this really, really, really well, where again, normally you tend to see a celebrity or an influencer or an icon on the front cover of a magazine, but again, that's been deemed relatively unimportant in the kind of global stance of what's happening at the moment, whereby frontline workers have become the new age influencers, the new age icons. Grazia did this at the beginning of the pandemic. Vogue did this a few days ago. And I think we're going to see much, much, much more about that over the coming months, because again, the relationship between brand and consumer has changed. We want a lot more meaning and a lot more human truth in relation to narratives in the coming months. So the common denominator across all these examples that we've shown you has been very much about purpose. Again, not to confuse it with the idea that you have to have a purpose, you have to be a purpose-driven brand, but your purpose is fundamentally clear at the core of everything you do. And that helps us question the importance of why. Why do we do something? Why do we say, why is this our message? Why should people believe in us? And these really help shape the sort of the core infrastructure of what a brand says and does.
And it also helps very much to engage with your customers on a fundamental and more engaging level. And that is because the why question sits in the emotional part of the brain. And just as a recap, the emotional part of the brain is that part that drives most of our decision making, most of your customers' behavior and purchase decisions. And only 10% of the brain is actually engaged or pays attention to facts and figures, or you know, what your product is all about. So we can see and draw the direct connection between why a focus on the why is so important when we compare it to where it is located in the brain, if you like. And on the next slide, you can see that the emotional part of the brain is very much driven by our beliefs, by our values, and our psychological needs. And hence, for example, when you value independence or freedom, and this is challenged, taken away from you, whatever it is, you will have an emotional reaction that is dissatisfying, anger, not happy, irritated, etc. So these values or the purpose of a brand directly communicates to the emotional part of the brain, which dominates, again, most of our behavior. And hence it's so much more important for brands to figure and answer the why question in order to increase engagement with their customers before they give attention to what are we doing, communicating what it is you do or how you're going to do it. Give much more emphasis on answering the why question, which allows you to achieve higher engagement with your customers and employees alike.
I mean, this can be kind of on the reverse side, can have negative, sort of negative impact. I mean, I don't know if everyone's seen or saw a few years ago the Pepsi advert with Kendall Jenner, whereby with one sip of a Pepsi drink and handing it over to a police officer in a peaceful protest, Kendall Jenner single-handedly solved world peace. Now, we know, I mean, we can think a little bit in the context of the time that we're living in right now over what's been happening across the US and the UK over the last couple of days, that is fundamentally a very untruthful thing to articulate. And Pepsi had absolutely no right from a mission or proposition point of view to sort of make claim to this kind of narrative. So you have to be on the opposing side to building out your why, understand what actually makes sense to you as a business, and solving world peace with the proposition of making everyone smile with every sip and taste makes no sense from an FMCG brand to sort of tap into very, very politically driven statements. Another example of this has been recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. From a social campaign point of view, ASOS released a product that looks like a trendy face mask at the early stages of the lockdown. Again, as a brand, they had absolutely no authority to create something that doesn't make sense both to the consumer and the zeitgeist of the moment. You know, their commentary of there's something missing from your wardrobe and we think it might be this. It's communication for communication's sake versus it being meaningful or relevant to what people are feeling, to what people naturally engage with the brand on a normal basis, and how they as a brand should have mobilized in the context of COVID-19. So again, really understanding your why and what this does in terms of impacting narratives all the way from your brand statement to your campaigns, to your social posts are really, really important to get right, or at least to interrogate as much as possible. So when we talk about brand purpose, we think about it in numerous ways, but whether you're a large corporation all the way through to a small startup, purpose is something that we all share. It's not exclusive to one entity over another. You might already have a brand purpose. You might already have something sort of set in stone that might need to be revisited, or it might need to be interrogated further to how you utilize it across campaign creative. You might just have a name or an idea of a brand, and therefore your purpose is going to help you shift or shape everything moving forward. There are lots of different ways to shape things, and we've seen a number of these slides. Everyone has seen a slide that looks like this at some stage of the game. Very, very scientific, very, very wordy, lots of diagrams, tables and charts, normally arrows pointing to things left, right and center and giving you quite ominous looking shapes on a screen. Some people even write a book about it. There are so many different ways to approach it. Some people like to shortcut it. Some people like to elongate the process as much as they possibly want. In our case, what we think about purpose is that a purpose is the business's reason for being. It is not about the service. It is an idealistic view for what for the reason for what the business does. Now, again, thinking about that logically is that you're not talking about I sell handbags and shoes. You're not talking about the fact that I have a tech platform that can solve world peace. You're talking about, why do I exist? What is the reason for my existence in the first place? An example of a really good proposition is Walt Disney. Their proposition is, or their purpose is to make people happy. Again, they're not talking about the Disney films or Disney World or any of the franchise. They're talking about the emotion they want to evoke when people engage with the brand world. When you watch a film from Disney, you feel a sense of nostalgia and happiness. I think even at the ripe old age of in your 60s, you can watch an old Disney movie and still feel happy. That's the mission that they are on, to ensure that it's sort of derivative across everything that they say and do across their content and narrative. Another example is IKEA. Their brand purpose is to create a better everyday for the many people. What does IKEA do other than sell flat pack furniture with a kind of cool, sweet Swedish twist? Well, effectively, your home is your everyday. You spend the most amount of time in your homes, and we're spending even more amount of time now in our homes thanks to the lockdown. And so what do they want to do? They want to help commoditize the idea of ensuring that your everyday, your home, is better. And they do that through their product, but they don't mention it here. It's, again, the feeling and the sentiment they want to try and evoke for the masses in terms of their product and service offering. Another example is Squarespace. They have a really nice purpose, helping creative ideas succeed. Again, they're not talking about the fact that they have a platform to create quick, easy websites for a better cost. They're talking about the fact that if you have an idea, if you have a business, we want to help that idea succeed, whatever shape or form that might take. So again, it's much, much more feeling and emotion orientated versus thinking about exactly what your product or service does. And this is so important because it is the top of your brand infrastructure. It holds the entire brand house together. It impacts what values you choose to work with, or what values you choose to sort of evolve with your brand. It has an impact in your tone and your behavior, the look and feel of your brand. It even helps shape product, from the services that you offer all the way through to the wider narrative that you might have with your product. And also subsequently, it will have an impact on what channel roles and responsibilities you choose to work with. So it's super important to look at and get as right as possible early on in the process. So thinking a little bit about how we can pivot or how we can shape narratives that last, there's some things that we need to sort of ask ourselves. But first and foremost, we all like to think that our product and our service is the best. No one starts a business or goes into a business thinking, I'm going to sell a mediocre idea. We all champion whatever we work with, because again, that is the energy behind the business. But what we tend to ask, or we tend to sort of think about, is, do our audiences really care, and why should they believe believe us, because at the end of the day, you are one in a million of other products and service offerings that they have access to. So again, to re-emphasize, purpose gives them a reason to believe. And the example on the screen is, as you can see, is Patagonia. And I think Patagonia is a really good example of a brand, again, who has seen they've got one part of their business is their product, their sort of outdoor apparel, which is their enabler. But the narrative of doing something better or looking at how they solutions or to inspire better solutions to the environment is actually their core reason for being, and shapes everything that they say and do. And it gives them a relationship with a customer so much more meaningful beyond the product, beyond the purchase of a product. It actually allows them to speak in numerous spaces that most other brands can't talk about. Doesn't mean that you have to be, again, a sort of a purpose or sort of environmentally friendly brand. It means that you're looking at yourself from a wider perspective, and that's why purpose is so important to get right. So what we tend to do at the very beginning of this sort of process, we ask ourselves some key questions. And again, the way this can sometimes take a little bit longer for others or a bit shorter for others, but there's a way to do this that helps kind of just aligned thinking to ensure that we kind of get certain points right from the get-go. And this is a task called the only statement, and it's very much an interrogation process about your brand narrative. So to give you an example of this is Harley Davidson. Again, nothing to do with COVID-19, nothing to do with Patagonia or any other brands that you've seen thus far, but they ask themselves this only statement. So Harley Davidson is the only motorcycle manufacturer that makes loud, big motorcycles for macho guys and macho wannabes in mostly the United States who want to join a gang of cowboys in an era of decreasing personal freedom. They looked at these statements and they kind of joined it together and saw that the narrative for them really was that we fulfill dreams of personal freedom. Now, that again has nothing to do with the motorcycle. It's this idea that when you sit on a motorbike and you switch on the ignition and you have the open road in front of you, that's the feeling of freedom that you want to try and evoke. And this helps form or inform all of their creative, their message from their press or their out of home to their website, to their social, to their TV. And what it does really, really nicely is that if they choose to change their creative look and feel over the next 5 years, this anchor point or central anchor point of personal freedom will hold the nuances of their creative together from start to finish. So it doesn't matter if they evolve slightly over time, there won't be a miscommunication between what they've done in the last 5 years to what they do now or moving forward. It holds everything really nicely together. So with that in mind, how do you take a proposition or a purpose and explode it into a great piece of thinking or a piece of creative or a narrative that sort of people can see externally? Now, there are some principles that we like to sort of think about, and we'll talk a little bit about them in detail. This one that you see on the screen, think differently. I think it's, you know, you're sort of probably thinking at this point, so what? Thinking differently, you might think differently to me and I might think differently to you. How can I sort of shape an idea around this concept of thinking differently? But some of the best ideas and best shapings of creative come from those who approach a problem differently. The example in the background is Beats music before they were sold to Apple. And rather than just providing a platform for playlists, a bit like Spotify and Apple and iTunes and so on and so forth, they wanted to understand why people listen to music. People listen to music based on mood, feeling, and sentiment. So what they did was they took this idea and they created a platform that allowed you to express what you're doing, how you're feeling, who you're with, and it would curate playlists according to that mood and emotion. So by thinking differently, they were able to create something that evoked or tapped into a relationship between how consumers normally tend to listen to music and what role music plays in their lives. This is one way they were able to shape a narrative to fit their brand. Another principle that we like to talk quite a lot about, and I think it's very, very topical right now in what's happening in the world. Over the last week, we've seen huge amounts of protests in the US and the UK about understanding the zeitgeist of now, and understanding culture is so incredibly important to help shape a narrative. Knowing what's trending, why it's trending, but also knowing when to jump on the bandwagon and when not to jump on the bandwagon. I think it's really important. The example we showed earlier around Pepsi and ASOS were bad examples of people just jumping on the proverbial cultural bandwagon. This example in the background was when in 2015, Serena Williams won the Grand Slam again, and Sports Illustrated made her the face of that edition of that magazine at the time, which is incredibly iconic, because in that period of time there'd only been two other female athletes who had been the faces of Sports Illustrated previously. And not only was she another female on the cover of Sports Illustrated, but she was another black woman, black athlete on the cover of Sports Illustrated, which again was incredibly iconic and against the grain. So again, understanding culture, understanding zeitgeist to be able to shape a narrative is really, really crucial. Another principle that we talk a lot about in terms of shaping narratives is a human truth. And we talked a little bit about this in the last session, about taking something that we can all relate to and exploding it into something that everyone can get behind. And I think the example behind here, we talked last week about Harvey Nichols using it from a campaign level. Marmite has used it from a brand level. You either love Marmite or you hate Marmite. It is a human truth. It is something that we all know and understand. And instead of just kind of using it for kind of a one-off statement or a one-off piece of branded content, they've used it to cover all their communications. They even play off it and humanize it to such an extent that it's really funny. Because again, when you evoke an emotion like humor, you remember it, and people have remembered you either love Marmite or you hate Marmite because it's so intrinsically human. So again, finding something that you can play off on a human level is also really, really important. Another example of shaping great narratives is having values at the core. The gentleman on the right of your screen is John Mackey. He is the co-founder of Whole Foods Market. I live with someone who eats, breathes and sleeps Whole Foods Market, hence why I've used this example in this presentation. But he really had his values at the core of everything he did from a business point of view, and his brand stemmed from his values. It didn't stem from an outward facing message or a product. It stemmed from the fact that he believed in something really, really fundamentally. Conscious capitalism is basically a very fancy way of saying profit with purpose, and he even wrote the book on it. So again, knowing how if you have values that are intrinsically part of your DNA, and using them to help shape narratives can be incredibly powerful and can lead a business from internal communications all the way through to external. And again, it can be impactful when it's directed at the consumer. Another example that we talk a little bit about is sell humanity, not technology. Again, looking, as we talked about before, looking beyond the product or service is so important, because again, I kind of classify it as output. Think about the output, what's on the other side of a story or a narrative that people are going to feel in order to sort of understand how that's going to impact your narratives. BBC iPlayer, so this example in the background, BBC iPlayer was rebranding, and instead of talking about all the upgrades and all the tech side of things in terms of their iPlayer, they talked about the stories that they're going to be telling rather than the platform, because the platform is just the enabler. It's what you get out of it that's more important to people. And again, people can relate to that. I don't care about iPlayer as a platform other than the content and the stories that I get to engage with. So again, thinking about the human element, not the technology, can be really, really powerful. And finally, and this is I think Frank's favorite statement, kill your babies. It always kind of makes me kind of shudder a little bit when I say this. It's not meant in a morbid sort of stance, but looking at ideas and being able to know the difference between a good idea or a relatable idea versus the first idea, because the first idea is never your last idea. Being critical is so important when it comes to shaping narratives. The example in the background was an app that was being developed for new mothers. And they wanted to find the right kind of content that would be the most valuable to new mothers. And they were thinking about whether they needed to have things such as weight trackers or baby growth trackers. But after doing a bit of focus grouping, after doing a few interviews, they understood that actually wasn't any of these two things. It was actually sleep tracking was something that was the most important to mothers or new mothers with their firstborns. So they were able to cull the idea that they had sort of presumed at the beginning of their process, and built their entire infrastructure around something that people genuinely wanted. And it meant that they had to be critical about their ideas. So It's really hard for creatives to turn around and say, no, we're not going to use this idea, but it's so important that you interrogate them, because it can be the make or break of a brand narrative. The way in which we tend to look at these things is through our sort of four-step simplified process to going live. We talked a little bit about in the previous session that when we normally work with brands together with an innovation bubble, we talk about the setup with a working session of joining the dots between the comms and industry landscape. And this is sort of a very quick fire round process of getting everybody on the same page at the beginning of a process. Internally, I think it's really important that narratives start internally within a business, not externally to the customer. Then we look at the exploration, the research and review. So again, consolidating infrastructure, ideas, audience reviews, digital reviews, and understanding what people are naturally feeling and doing in that moment in time in relation to the brand. And then how we develop it. And this is where the narrative starts to take shape, because we've got all these ideas from within the business and externally from the customer. Now, how do you put those two and two together? And comms development and validation is really an important phase for us, because again, this is where we, in inverted commas, kill our babies, as it were, to validate or litmus test what makes the most amount of sense in relation to what people are feeling. So it's not coming up with an idea, throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, or producing something and then going live and then iterating massively afterwards. What you want to try and do here is reduce the risk of losing that central thread of communication that you started with, and ensure that things are as watertight as possible before producing any kind of content or comms. So for us, that kind of key message across everything is to validate upfront, not after launch. You will be tweaking things a little bit over time, but again, that the importance of ensuring that you're doing as much validation and verification in the process of development is so important, because again, that will help ensure that you're reducing time, risk, budget restraints, to ensure that you've got the best solution to take to market as much as possible. So an example of a brand that we worked with that did this process was M&G Prudential. Again, you think, how can you make a really cool, quirky narrative out of a very sort of heavyweight investment bank? And the task for us at that moment in time was to help find a route in for them, because they are a heritage brand when it comes to investment banking, and they wanted to start speaking to, as they kind of classified it, sort of the everyday Joe blogs on the street. And the problem is that the everyday Joe blogs on the street doesn't really understand investment banking, doesn't really understand the concept that investments take time. It's not instant money, it's not always predictable, and it's sometimes incredibly complex. So much like life in itself, we had to find a way to re-educate the internal team to start thinking differently about their own narrative to their customer. And that was about re-engineering or re-understanding our relationship with time, because if we think about it, all good things take just that little bit more time. Whether it's new beginnings, they're worth the waiting game. Your startup, your business idea, it's worth the wait. Your future is worth the wait. And investments, the time that you put into them is worth the wait. The more you give to that idea of time can help shape a narrative about that investment banking can be accessible to the everyday Joe on the street if they understand the constructs of time. Now that's an example of a narrative that was shaped based on a business that already exists and sort of a heavyweight brand. It also works on the opposing side for a startup. We work with a brand that literally came to us with a name and an idea. They had nothing else. They had no content, they had no narrative, they had no infrastructure at all. They were a brand that was going to disrupt the learner or the learning to drive marketplace. So again, they wanted to appeal to two completely separate audiences, driving instructors and learner drivers, with their app that allow people to book, take control of their lessons, and equally for the instructor side of things, take control of their business. So how do you shape a narrative around something that doesn't exist, that you have no insight for, and it's completely new on the marketplace? Well, we thought about asking the question is, what do you feel when you take control of your business? You don't have to be a driving instructor to feel this way. You can be any kind of business. But from an instructor point of view, what do you feel when you take control of your business? As a learner or someone learning to drive, what do you feel when you have your what do you think you're going to feel when you have your license? So our approach was really to focus on the output of what people feel when they have this level of control over something. So we have that fit those two people, approach to this was getting in the driving seat. Your world becomes your oyster, no matter what that looks like from a business point of view, all the way through to someone who's learning to drive. And this created this wider narrative of being able to experience things that you didn't get to experience without utilizing this service.
And yeah, we want to talk about one case study that we worked on, and coming back to the point of validating whatever you're creating in terms of your narrative before you go out to launch. And we worked with a big global bank that didn't do this. They spent a lot of money on trusting that whatever they got from traditional research and assumptions within the company, that their narrative was around trusting and being a trustworthy bank, and shaping the narrative around that being trustworthy, because their feedback was customers don't trust banks. And it wasn't successful at all. In fact, they actually lost customers with this campaign and narrative. And so they were asking us to come in and find out what the issue here was. And when we went in and did interviews with customers, what we found was the topic was trust, but it wasn't about customers not trusting the bank. It was about customers not trusting themselves in their abilities to do proper financial management confidently, and also confidently trusting their abilities to engage with the new toys, if you like, that the bank was developing online, where customers were struggling with. They felt ashamed to ask questions in the branch. For example, they felt stupid, exposing themselves that they didn't quite know more than being in the plus or being in minus. And when we revealed this, that they needed to change the narrative around enabling customers or making them feel more confident in their own abilities, trusting themselves when engaging with the bank, which was done in multiple channels. So not just in the communication, but also with call centers, the way they engage with, the way they ask questions, in the branches as well, online. That then led to very significant changes in reduction in call centers, 11% reduction in churn, 6% increase in market growth. So yeah, it is extremely important to validate whatever you come up with as a narrative, and get feedback from the audience of how they perceive that, in order to save you a lot of money and budget.
So just to summarize everything we've tried to sort of condense today, again, we could talk till the cows come home about narratives and lots of different principles and ways to think about things. I mean, it's a creative angle, isn't it? So there's so many different ways to talk about it. But I think if you took anything away from today, the most important areas to sort of consider are: establish a brand purpose that will tie all your content creative together. It's important that everything sort of feeds from or sings from the same hymn sheet. Interrogate your narrative. Again, that method of, kill your babies. Don't be afraid to cull things that you don't think make sense. Validate it, verify it. Don't be afraid to interrogate it a bit further. Think wider. Don't be too narrow in the playing field. Again, people are not two-dimensional. People have other interests outside of your own brand and product. So think about what other things are going to be important to them, and how can you shape your narrative around that. And then finally, and I think most importantly, ladder back to your why or your purpose. It should always be your central anchor. It holds it together. It sits at the very top of the spectrum when it comes to your brand house. And it really should give you that sort of questioning every single time you're doing something new or trying something different. Does it make sense in relation to my why or my purpose? And hopefully then you'll have a really consolidated and really impactful brand narrative to move forward with. So from this, I know it's quite a lot to take in, but are there any questions? You can either unmute yourself and talk, or you can write in the chat box. If not, we'll have to take questions later. But if there are, feel free to drop a note. If not, we can move on.
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Yeah. So if you have any questions that you want to chat through, we're really happy to do a sort of 20-minute one-to-one info chat session where we talk a little bit about any sort of thoughts or considerations or feelings that you might have around your brand narratives or anything to do with your brand comms for that matter. And then depending on that, if you're thinking about how you shift or how you pivot, a workshop to address that brand pivot or that brand shift. So happily get in touch with us. We've got our details at the end of this. But next week we'll be talking specifically about channel roles, and again taking this information and applying it into actions, because again it's all very well and good having this understanding about brand and understanding about audiences and how and what it looks and feels like, but how it responds to things is really, really important as well. So for our final session, same time next week, we'll be chatting about channel roles and responsibilities. So you can be in touch with us on these details, but thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and we hope to see and speak to you next week.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.